there you go. All right.
This could be on the show, since I feel like this is. In fact, I'm going to start the show. It's This Week in Charles Bronson, the only news and pop culture program that revolves around one weirdo's obsession with the late great action movie star, and that weirdo is me. And today we have author, journalist, talking head, TV producer, and all around Hollywood nice guy, Mr. Burt Kearns. Burt, how you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me.
And today we're talking about his book, which I read and I loved, called Lawrence Tierney, Real Life Hollywood Tough Guy. And I'm going to start off with a simple question. It's a two-parter. Why a book about Lawrence Tierney? And was that a risk? Were you taking a risk there, that people didn't know who he was or wouldn't be interested? For someone like me, I see that there's this big history and background behind Elaine's father that I didn't know, or I don't even need to know that he was Elaine's father. All I need to know is that that it's a long Hollywood history, and it goes back to that old Hollywood era, and I'm hooked. Are there enough people like me out there, or is this a risk? Right into taking, is it a risk that a book like this may or may not sell?
Yeah, it was from the beginning. I was doing research on another project, on another book. We were doing a book called "The Show Won't Go On," which was a book about performers who died on stage. So I was really in the deep dives of all the newspaper websites and magazines and books, et cetera. And I came upon a story, just popped up, and it said, Lawrence Tierney arrested for the 13th time.
Yeah.
And I said, that's very interesting. I looked at it and I said, he was arrested for the 13th time on a drunkenness rap. And I said, wait a minute. I drank with this guy once. I remember this. There was a bar. There still is a bar called the Formosa Cafe in West Hollywood. And it's one of these places that had been around since the 1920s. You know, in the 1940s, the movie stars hung out there. It was next door to the old Warner Brothers lot. And in the 90s, you'd have a mixture of some of these old timers sitting at the bar. And then over there in the corner, hey, there's Keanu Reeves, there's Quentin Tarantino, there's an actor, there's an actress, because the young hipsters hung out there. And I was at the bar one night and sitting by myself, and this old gruff guy with a short sleeve shirt sitting next to me. How you doing? My name's Larry. How are you? Shook hands, had a little conversation with him. And I remembered at the time, I said, I think I know. I think that's the guy that's in Reservoir Dogs. Yeah, wow, look at that. I really had no other interest or memory of him. So fast forward about 30 years, I started looking into Lawrence Tierney's background, and I said, this is very interesting. And so I just started doing it on my own, started digging up stories. The way I started it was I found a story and I typed it out. And then I found another story, typed it out, and came up with a list. It started in about 1919 when he was born, all the way up through 2002 when he died and past that. I came up with about 500 single-spaced pages of newspaper and magazine stories and book excerpts that I had just sort of, copied down, just sort of transcribed, but didn't really think about. And then I sat back and I read it. It's like, oh, great. Look, okay. Young guy. He's from Brooklyn. He's working in theater in New York. Oh, he's working as a model. And oh, look, he's discovered. He's on his way to Hollywood. Okay, great. He's in this. Well, wait a minute. Now he's in this movie Dillinger. And he's just been arrested for being drunk. Oh, here he goes again. And I kept reading it, and to me, it was sort of a cliffhanger. What's he going to do to screw up his life next? And most unbelievably, this managed to go on, and a career managed to go on for maybe 6 decades. This also coincided with the pandemic and the lockdown. So suddenly work stops, we're sitting at home, and I just sat, and this became my lockdown project. For about 6 months, I started putting the book together and writing it. Sent it out to some agents, sent it out to people who knew. Well, who the hell is Lawrence Tierney? Nobody knew who Lawrence Tierney was, and nobody cared. Then I get a tip from my co-author, Jeff Abraham, who says, hey, there's this guy, Lee Sobel, who's got this agency, and he sells these pop culture books. And I saw that he had sold a book by Sylvain of the New York Dolls.
Yeah.
And so I knew Sylvain. I knew the Dolls from back, past life back in New York. And I got in touch with Lee, sent him a query. The guy calls me back in 5 minutes, and he said, I've been trying for the last 5 years to get one of Lawrence Tierney's friends to write a book about Lawrence Tierney.
Wow.
So within a week, Lee had 4 or 5 offers for the book, and there we got it sold. The University Press of Kentucky, which has a great screen imprint, a great Hollywood history imprint, put together a really nice looking book, and been out there ever since. And found a lot of people who do appreciate Lawrence Tierney, people who didn't realize who he was. They all know him from different, things that he'd done. Some people know him from Reservoir Dogs. Some people remember him as Elaine's father in Seinfeld. Some people remember him from Born to Kill, or the old film noir that he was in. So there are Lawrence Tierney fans out there, but yes, it's a hard sell.
Now, I'm one of those people who I didn't need to know who he was. I really interested in, I'd rather read a book about Lawrence Tierney than I would want to read a book about, let's say Brad Pitt or something like that.
Right.
Like I like, well, first I'm a nerd for old Hollywood, but I'm also like just a nerd for knowing the stories of someone that may or may not be as well known. Like we had a guest on the show, Jordan Rhodes. He wrote his own autobiography. He's still alive at 83, the life of a blue collar actor. And he called himself the blue collar actor because he was really like, I mean, he was a step below, I guess, what you would call a character actor. Like he was like he was in just about everything, but he never really had a career that totally took off. But he had but I'd rather read something like that. So I'm a nerd for that, and I feel like a lot of other people are. And I feel like with you mentioned COVID, and COVID comes up in a lot of our interviews. I mean, this is my COVID project. You know what I mean? Like I started just reaching out to I do stand-up comedy. I used to be in punk bands. And I had a feeling when I saw that you wrote for Please Kill Me, I had a feeling me and you probably liked a lot of the same things. I'm a big New York Dolls, Ramones, Dictators. I'm a big early 70s New York punk nerd. But I think there's more people like us out there that are just, and with COVID and with people podcasting and with people having these pages that are so like my page, which is so like specific. Charles Bronson, like somebody, a friend of mine who's also a listener and was once a guest of the show, I guess saw something that you posted, and he knew that Lawrence Tierney was in the film Murphy's Law with Charles Bronson, which we'll get to later. And you put that in there, and that's all I needed to know to do a little bit of research. I was like, I want to read that book. I'm more interested in that than I am reading the stories of a big star, or I mean, somebody that there may be a lot of, you may already have heard a lot about or whatever.
Yeah, I find those stories to be more interesting.
Yeah.
I did a documentary some years ago about Neil Innes, who was the man who did the music for the Ruddles, and he did the music for Monty Python. He was a Monty Python associate whose best friend was George Harrison, who made his first album with the Bonzo Dog Band. The first single was produced by Paul McCartney, and he was someone who was on the sidelines of fame for 40 years, but never wanted to be famous. Well, of course, there's another hard sell. And my son, about 8 years old at the time, said, "Dad, when are you ever going to do a project about somebody that people have heard of?" But it goes back to my newspaper days, my journalism days, my days doing, nonfiction television, which I still do. And is that these stories are more interesting.
Yeah,
the story
they are.
Of a guy who has talent that is ranked up there with Clark Gable, with Marlon Brando, with Humphrey Bogart, but something stops him from achieving that success. And every time he does, it's one step forward, two step backwards. He does everything he can to disingratiate himself, I don't know if that's a word, from Hollywood, yet he manages to move on into the 21st century when he gets started in 1943. He has two brothers who basically lived clean lives. They live regular lives. They had their ups and downs. One brother dies at 55. His other brother dies at 60. He makes it to 17 days shy of 83.
Wow.
So, as his nephew said, tell me what's the best way to live.
Right. And if you read this book, that's a shocker,
Yeah.
Now let's talk about where he came from. He comes from New York, but his Hollywood for him starts after World War II, correct?
During World War II, he shows up in Hollywood in 1943.
Mm-hmm.
He's working in New York City with Irish theater. He's doing some theater work, but he's also doing modeling for catalogs. And the modeling is actually what got him to Hollywood. He went with a friend who had an audition with RKO Radio Pictures, and the secretary or assistant to the talent scout saw Lawrence Tierney sitting in the lobby waiting for his buddy and invited him in. The next thing you know, Tierney is invited out to Hollywood. He says he arrived in Hollywood on July 4th, 1943. He would have been 24 years old. Comes to Hollywood, lots of promises. We're going to make you a star. You're going to be the biggest star we've ever seen. He gets to Hollywood. They spend the next year he's just kind of wandering around the RKO lot. They're putting him in little bit pieces, a taxi cab driver here. Let's have him play an orchestra conductor here. They're doing nothing with him, don't really know what to do. So he's got about a year. He's been in Hollywood for about a year. RKO Radio Pictures is thinking about not picking up his option. Even today, when I first came out, to quote Hollywood back in the 90s, with Paramount, they give you these contracts where you're locked in for maybe 3 years or 7 years, but they can fire you every 12 weeks. That's how his contracts work. And that's how Tierney's contract worked. So he's sitting around, he's doing nothing. He looks in the trades and he sees that an independent independent producer is doing a movie on John Dillinger, who was Public Enemy #1 in the 1930s. He walks up there. It's an area called Poverty Row. These are the low budget studios that put out these genre pictures and these quick B and C movies. Tierney goes up there. As the legend goes, the guys are out to lunch. Tierney swipes a script off the secretary's desk, learns a scene, goes in, gets the part. Well, in the end, he did get the part. In 1944, he starts filming Dillinger. I think it was a 7-day shoot. They even used some stock footage from other films. The movie's released in February. He's a relative unknown, and it opens in New York City in April of 1945. Overnight, Tierney becomes a sensation. He is Dillinger. He is the new movie bad guy. He is the big new star from Hollywood. Here he was loaned out for something like $100 a week from RKO Radio Pictures to the brothers who ran the independent studio. Next thing they say is, you can have Tierney for your next role, but it's going to be $35,000 a week instead. So suddenly Tierney's a star.
And a lot of these B movies or bit parts that he was in, because he was a star, now they start re-releasing them again. And
right.
Yeah. With different, which is something that went on for a long time. That kind of stuff went on in the 80s and drive-in theater days of 70s and 80s, where they would, like, even with Charles Bronson, I mean, when he became popular, they would dig up old Western TV shows that he did, and they splice a couple together and give it a couple of episodes of The Virginian or something together and call it something, re-release it on video,
Yeah.
But I find that really interesting. And now I'm a recovering alcoholic myself, so this book hits me in a different way. So I think this interview is gonna take a little turn here for about 10 minutes, but I think it's really interesting read for somebody who suffered with alcoholism the way that Lawrence Tierney did. I mean, the book itself, and I have to be careful not to break any traditions or anything, 12-step traditions, but the book reads like one of those stories in the back of a 12-step book. And those stories are usually about 7 to 10 pages long. They're usually horrific, humorous, but also funny. But with some, I mean, not also funny. I mean, I just said humorous. They're often horrific with a little bit of humor, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel. This book feels like one of those stories that just keeps going on and on and on. And it feels like you're never going to see a light at the end of the tunnel. And in a way you don't, but I want to talk about that later. At times I had to put it down. I almost started to feel guilt and shame for this gentleman, and it became a little uncomfortable. Although humorous, because it is. I mean, when you look back at that kind of behavior, it is humorous, and for people who never suffered with alcoholism, it's more humorous to them. But did it ever become uncomfortable for you? Were you, or are you just able to disconnect when you're doing your work, or you know what I mean? Like, did you ever start to feel like some real strong empathy or sympathy for this guy?
Well, yeah, I came out to Hollywood. My life was changed when I went from working in local television news and network news in New York City to being kidnapped by Rupert Murdoch's Australians onto a show called A Current Affair, and going on a 5 or 6 year journey through the seas of the tabloid world until was spit off onto shore, a few years later. There was a lot of drinking going on. Everything was built around the pub, the bar. When I was first hired, I had been a producer of a local news show. The guy said, "Look, there's a guy who runs this show. He's a genius. He's from Australia, but the issue is he doesn't like to work in the office. He works at the bar across the street. Your job will be to take the brilliance that he is conjuring up in that bar, bringing it across the street to the newsroom and getting it on the air. What do you say?" I said, "Great." I wound up spending the next 6 years in bars. A lot of heavy drinking in Los Angeles. We came out to Los Angeles. It was like arriving on the moon as opposed to New York City, bars that closed early. Where's the action? We just, drank in hotel bars, drank in these old bars that guys like Lawrence Tierney were hanging out in. And you begin to feel that, yeah, I'm an alcoholic. When at one point, my friend Raphael Abramovitz, who was a great television reporter, said, no, the difference is these guys are alcoholics. You're an alcohol abuser. And
Right.
there's a big difference. And it's like, and you realize that. So I did have sympathy for Lawrence Tierney. The more I, read on, the more I spoke to people who knew him later in life, when he became friends with a lot of these young people that he had met in these bars that he had originally hung out in back in the 40s. Now in the 90s and 80s and 90s, he's back at the bars, but now there's a young crowd there. So yeah, I definitely did feel for him. I also felt bad for him because he continually said, "I'm powerless."
Mm-hmm.
He would apologize. He'd say, "I can't help myself. I've tried Alcoholics Anonymous. I've tried it. It's not working for me." Although he did stick with and vouch for the program to the end of his life. When he was living in Venice, California, near the boardwalk, he would see homeless people and derelicts and go over to them and say, "Hey, there's a meeting. You should go to this. You should go to the meeting." He still was a proselytizer for it. But it seemed to me, and I thought that this might be a bit controversial, I felt that Alcoholics Anonymous let him down, just as the justice system let him down, just as the studios let him down. It seemed that, and again, one thing I did in the book was I traced his story through the columns, the way that the gossips and the Hollywood columnists would cover everything that was happening to him along the way. And they found great humor in it. He was one of these people you could always throw he's like an Andy Dick or a Chris Farley. You can always throw in a column with some sort of, exploit. And there was never any sympathy for Lawrence Tierney. There was no sympathy for him when he would say, I'm powerless. And it seemed that part of the AA problem with him was that they would say, and the columnists would say it, and I think that his sponsors would say it, is that if you were stronger morally, you'd be able to lick this thing, and so he would try, he would white knuckle it and not drink for 6 months at a time, and then slip. And then once he slipped, he'd say, "I'm no good. It's not worth it." And then he would just binge again. And so it was a sad story, because a lot of this stuff happened when he, was ready to make a breakthrough.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you want me to stop? Or you want me to keep going with this?
No, keep going. What were you saying? I didn't want to interrupt you.
For instance, I think it was about 1952. His career is basically lost. He gets roles here and there. Once in a while, he's getting a role. He gets a role in a movie called The Greatest Show on Earth. Cecil B. DeMille gives him the role as the bad guy in the Midway at the circus. And Cecil B. DeMille takes a liking to him and goes, Tierney's good. And he's in a movie with James Stewart and Cornell Wilde and Charlton Heston. And he's the bad guy in the movie. He's doing great. There's one scene where there had to be 9 actors in one shot. And DeMille is having trouble. I don't know how I'm going to do. How am I going to fit all these 9 actors? Larry says, excuse me, Mr. DeMille, why don't you try this? And everybody freezes. He's telling me what to do. Director tries it and it works. And he loves it. Wow. He says to Tierney, he says, you know what? I really like you. This movie is going to do well. It wound up winning the Oscar for Best Picture that year. He said, I'm going to give you a 3-picture deal at Paramount. And you're going to have insurance. I'm going to get your career on track because you're a great guy. We all like you. Well, that was great until Lawrence got arrested again for a drunken binge, and that went right out the window. And this happened time and time again.
So I have 3 things about what you just said.
Yeah.
Only 2 that I'm going to tell you, because one of them I can't get into because I would be breaking some kind of tradition or something. But I disagree with you on two. Is it 3 things? And I said 3, but now I forget what one of them is. So 2 things. But you say there's nobody had sympathy for him. And now, as an alcoholic myself, I found a lot of times when you study your disease and you reflect and you introspect and you're working on yourself, you start to learn about family dynamics, and you learn about the enabler and the different roles people play in your life. This book is brilliant because, especially for somebody who's familiar with alcoholism, because the family dynamic was played by the 3 critics, the writers, Jimmy Fiddler, Hedda Hopper, and I wrote the name down. Sheila Graham.
Sheila Graham.
Or Graham. Was it Graham and Hedda, or it was 4 critics then, I guess.
Yeah.
I feel like Jimmy Fiddler, he was the toughest on him. But I think Jimmy Fiddler does not get the credit of having sympathy. I think Jimmy Fiddler knew that this was a problem that was not going to be solved by giving this guy praise, and yeah, Jimmy Fiddler was tough on him.
Oh, he was.
But I feel like Jimmy Fiddler, in a way, was the only one of them that showed sympathy. I think, I don't remember which one it was, but one of the females really was the enabler, I think. And I found that very interesting because I feel like Hollywood and these people, this became his family dynamic. I don't feel like his regular family was enough for him to stay sober. He didn't have a wife or kids. And I don't think any of us that I know, I mean, I lost a good career through my alcoholism. I don't think career, even a Hollywood career, is enough for a lot of people to get sober. So, yeah, I feel like the one person who actually saw that this was a problem that needed real psychiatric help, real spiritual help, real love was Jimmy Fiddler, even though he was very tough on him.
Yes, you're totally correct on that. He was the one who would say, this man is dangerous. He's going to kill someone. Someone is going to get killed, and he needs to be institutionalized. He needs medical help. At one point, he said, I feel very sorry for his family. He's got 2 younger brothers who are in Hollywood trying to make it as actors. I feel sorry for his parents who are out here. Within a year, that changed. He goes, I no longer feel sorry for his parents. And his family. They are the ones who should be alongside him and getting him help. I mean, 1951, October 1951, was probably the most public display, and for me, the one that made me feel the worst. It was the most heartbreaking. Santa Monica police, Santa Monica, California, get a call that a quote bum, a barefoot bum, is hanging around St. Monica's Church, a Roman Catholic church. That's the church that they based the movie Going My Way with Bing Crosby. They based it on that church. Police arrive. It's about 6 o'clock in the morning. They see the guy outside the church. He runs inside. 2 cops follow him in. It's Lawrence Tierney, and he's at the altar in the sanctuary, and he's saying, "I have sanctuary. You can't arrest me." You're not going to kill me like you killed Robert Walker. Now, the actor Robert Walker, who was also a very bad alcoholic, had died recently when his doctor had given him some sort of injection for whatever was going on with him, and he died at his house. And Tierney was in a state of total mania, alcoholic, whatever that's called. They had to make a makeshift straitjacket. They put him away. They brought him to a sanitarium, and Jimmy Fiddler basically wrote the obituary for Tierney. He said, "This is, something I knew that was going to happen, and this is how the Lawrence Tierney story ends. We're probably not going to see Lawrence Tierney ever again." 2 weeks later, Lawrence Tierney pops up at a bar, barefoot, wanting to fight anybody in the house, and he's arrested again. And it's the story of Lawrence Tierney being arrested for the 13th time. He goes before this judge, who apparently he had been before this judge a dozen times. It wasn't the 13th arrest, by the way. It was more like the 23rd by this time. And the judge says, "Okay, this is it, Mr. Tierney. You have really crossed the line too many times. You've been before me. I've given you fines. I've given you 5-day jail sentences here and there, but it's time for you to go away for a long time because this can't go on anymore. But I'll make a deal with you. If you promise never to drink again, I'll let you off on probation." And Tierney says, "Your Honor, you have my word. I will never drink again. I'm done with it." This is what goes on, what went on, where
Right.
Needed help. They just.
I feel like nobody, and maybe at that time a lot less people did, or not maybe, I'm sure at that time a lot less people understood alcoholism. But I feel like there was some of the things that Jimmy Fiddler said that I almost felt like he might have had an understanding of it, and maybe even had some of it in his life. And yeah, when I read that in the book, I thought, oh man, like that's the worst, when you tell your wife or you tell somebody, yeah, I'm not going to drink again. And you can do it sometimes. Sometimes you can do it for 6 months to a year, but you're not a good person. You're not happy. You're miserable. And I just knew that was going to be a nightmare. And when I read that in the book, and that brings me to a question, because I'm not so sure that, because of the way the Hollywood studio systems and the way his career kind of bounced around from films and then into TV and this and that. Do you think he would have been a huge film star had it not been for alcohol? Or do you think that maybe the studios didn't really promote him right? Or do you think maybe it was a little bit of both?
Well, it wasn't just alcohol. I mean, Tierney definitely had mental issues.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we would call him bipolar, if he had CTE because of the beatings he took, many of the beatings at the hands of the police, because when he was arrested, he's not somebody that would ever go quietly. They would have to bring him down with billy clubs to the head. As a matter of fact, when he was older, some of the guys who were young kids hanging out with Tierney when he was older would laugh because he would ask young women to rub his head.
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, "Oh, that's kind of kinky, but it's harmless. That's a funny thing." Until I found a woman who knew Tierney when she was a teenager in the 1950s. He had lived on and off at her house because he knew her father. She lived in a borough of New York City, and he would ask her to rub his head because he got tremendous headaches. And she knew back then, she said, well, it was because of the drinking and the beatings that he took. So it was more than just that. He also had this rage, this need to fight, this need to just go off and pummel people. He was a big, scary guy. But the sad part was, and what made this book for me different than the usual, riches to rags, Hollywood Babylon story, was that he was a very, very talented actor, and you can see that in the roles he did. Dillinger was probably his, one of the least effective roles he had, because he really didn't play Dillinger, but he was a really powerful actor, and you knew that because of the reviews he got when he played on stage. He never made it to Broadway. He wanted to make it onto Broadway. I think at one point he almost did, but got in a fight with the director and left. Another time he was very close, He was working with his latest girlfriend at the time, who was Gloria Vanderbilt. The director accused him of being drunk in a rehearsal and threw him out. But he did a lot of what they call the straw hat circuit, summer stock movies, plays outside of Manhattan. He starred in The Last Mile, playing Killer Mears, which was originally played by Spencer Tracy and Clark Gable. Got great reviews for that. He was in The Petrified Forest, where he had the role that was Humphrey Bogart's role originally on Broadway. Again, compared favorably to Bogart. He was in A Streetcar Named Desire. He played that in New Mexico. Got tremendous reviews on opening night. Didn't show up the following night because he went to the bar and went on another bender.
That's what we do. That's what we do. We self-destruct. Especially when things are going good.
But the one role that I heard about, I couldn't track it down. Then I finally tracked it down. It was 1974. He appeared in Death of a Salesman in Phil. It was a special production in Philadelphia. I think Martin Balsam played Willie Loman. Tierney played Uncle Ben, who was a ghostly figure in the play, but he understudied the role of Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman. The director was George C. Scott.
Wow.
Well, turns out this was another Lawrence Tierney story where somebody in the production gets drunk, goes crazy, runs away from the production before opening night. Wow. In this case, it wasn't Tierney, it was George C. Scott. And who stepped in as director but Arthur Miller, the playwright. So here you have Lawrence Tierney in 1974, when he's making a living at this point as a horse and buggy driver in Central Park, in Death of a Salesman, directed by Arthur Miller. And that's the kind of talent this guy had. No matter what he did to screw up his potential future in Hollywood or in the arts, people kept hiring him because they knew that he could come through.
And because this is This Week in Charles Bronson, Martin Balsam, as everybody knows, was in Death Wish 3. And Jan Gann Boyd, who co-starred with Charles Bronson, told me a story off the air about a poker game she attended with Charles Bronson, Lee Marvin, and George C. Scott, and a number of other people. So I thought that's really cool. And speaking of Charles Bronson, this is really more about Lawrence Tierney. But so my introduction, from what I remember, is Murphy's Law. Yeah. Now, when I was a kid, when I watched that movie, when I was 14 or 15, I don't know, I didn't know the name Lawrence Tierney. But when he showed up as that private detective, I was like, that guy is somebody. And then when she kills him, I thought, why did they kill that guy? He's somebody big, like he's somebody. And then, of course, I read the book. And I see he was on Remington Steele in 1985, which I loved. I loved all those old cop shows, even the ones from the 60s. I would watch the reruns with my grandfather. Tales from the Dark Side, which I was hooked on, which was very interesting. I've tried to find that on YouTube. He plays an exorcist with Phyllis Diller. We got to talk about that.
It's on our website. Sorry, there's a link there's a link on the Lawrence Tierney book website.
Oh, is there? Oh, great. I got to watch that. I was a Tales from the Dark Side addict. Yeah. And then, of course, I realized, it had to be Hill Street Blues. My parents watched that every week. So it's like, of course. But he had one of those faces where it was just like, and then I'm looking at the movie and I'm thinking, man, he could have played the big bad guy. He could have played the mafia lead or something. Like, was he I know he was still difficult to work with, but we don't know anything about his experience with Charles Bronson or anything, do we? Like if they got along or any. I know Charles Bronson was difficult in his own way, from what I hear.
No, I know he did it in 1959. He was on Man with a Camera, which was Bronson's show. That show aired in January of 1960. He played an ice cream vendor who was actually selling dope at an amusement park. It was called Hot Ice Cream, and he had a great fight scene with Bronson at the end of in the final scene, which I kind of compared to what someone might witness in a bar. You got to see Tierney in action, fighting, Charles Bronson, and this was their reunion, 25 years later. But they didn't share any scenes. I think that Tierney was probably just cast because they needed. He was filling those roles at that time when they needed, a gruff old guy to play an old cop or an old private eye. He was the guy they called.
I just felt like, even though I didn't know who he was, I felt like he looked too tough to play this private detective that just gets blown away by that lady. I don't know if you ever watched it, but
Oh, I sure did.
yeah, it's kind of like he gets kind of like cowardly, and I just like, I almost feel like I did know who he was, like, but I didn't, and I was just like, man, that guy's too. It doesn't work. He's too tough looking. He should have been like something else. I felt like
This is a little bit off topic, but when I did screen Murphy's Law when I was doing the book. One of my best friends is in the picture. There's a scene in the airport where he shoots the mobster and the guy crashes through the window.
Yes.
That's my friend Chris DeRose. Chris is one of the leading animal activists in Hollywood. He runs a group called Last Chance for Animals. And we first worked with him when we did the show Hard Copy. We did a lot of segments with him and became friends with Chris. Chris is the guy who, when Kim Basinger wants to go save the tigers or Cher wants to save the elephants, they send Chris and he does it. And he's been in jail. He's a true
We'd love to have him. We'd love to have him on the show. You know,
he's terrific. When he started in Hollywood, this was very interesting. He started in Hollywood. He was managed by, I think, a guy named Herbie Nanis, and Herbie managed three people: John Travolta, Chris DeRose, and Ray Sharkey. Do you remember Ray Sharkey?
I know the name. I'm trying to picture him
From the show Wise Guy.
Yes.
The Idol Maker. I think he was the Idol Maker.
Mm-hmm.
Sharkey died of AIDS.
Wow.
And so, Chris and those three guys started. Chris's big role was in a TV series called the San Pedro Beach Bums. I don't know if you remember that show. It's short.
That was the name of a TV show?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
An Animal House show. Yeah, you can find clips on YouTube, I think.
I remember some shows. Thank God for YouTube, because I will remember television shows, and people will tell me I'm crazy, and then it'll pop up on Facebook. I'll be like, I knew it. I knew I wasn't insane. But
that's another reason why everybody says that Quentin Tarantino rediscovered Lawrence Tierney in 1991 when they shot Reservoir Dogs. But he, through most of the 1980s, he was on just about every dramatic television series that there was. He was on Hunter.
Hunter is another show that I loved. Yeah.
He did ER. He was on all, and of course everybody remembers him from that role in Seinfeld, which was supposed to be, they liked him so much it was supposed to be a recurring role. He was going to get a recurring role and have a regular paycheck and insurance, but he blew it that day.
No, Jerry Seinfeld was one of the people who just was not afraid of him and didn't put up with his shit. He pretty much approached him about stealing the knives, or he had a habit of a little bit of a kleptomania going on, right?
Yes, he did. But in his later years, he did. You'd go to a restaurant with Tierney or a diner, his friends would tell me, and he'd go off into the men's room and come back and say, "Got to get out of here! Got to get out of here!" While all the silverware is clinking in his pockets. He just had this need to do that. You go to a car wash with him, and they would charge an extra $25 to the guy getting his car washed. He'd say, well, because your pal just stole a pair of sunglasses. It's like, okay, that's the Larry tax. Everybody kind of took that for granted at the end with him. But with Seinfeld, he played the frightening war veteran father of Elaine, Julia Louis-Dreyfus's character. And he played it deadpan, very straight, because as he told David Del Valle and C. Courtney Joyner, his friends at the time, he didn't get the jokes. He didn't think it was funny. He didn't get the humor. So he played it straight, but he was hilarious.
That's what made it funny. I mean, I think if he would have tried to play it funny,
as if he was in The Naked Gun, which he was in The Naked Gun, which is interesting. He played the baseball manager.
He
was in The Naked Gun. He got realizing, wait a minute, I didn't realize he was around that much. But he did. They were doing a scene on the Jerry apartment set. The audience was there. The cast was going over what the scene was going to be. And they noticed that Tierney went over to the butcher block and took a big knife and put it under his jacket. And they all traded looks and said, did you see that? I'm not going to go up to him. But Jerry did. And he said, hey, Larry, what's with the knife? And Larry said, well, he was embarrassed and, turned a little red and said, well, I guess that was just in case I had to, stab you in the head. And then he imitated Anthony Perkins in Psycho and went, whereupon the director said, get him out of here.
That sounds like the kind of thing, some kind of thing I would have said when I was drinking, and sometimes when I'm not, still now. I have that awkwardness with me where where my humor is always like very inappropriate.
Right.
I can feel for him in that. It's
Yeah,
probably what I would say. Like, I don't know what else I would do.
right. And that's the other thing with Tierney was he was a very funny guy. I mean,
Mhm.
that's the thing. He was funny, and he resented the fact that he was always typecast as the heavy because he had a
Mhm.
great sense of humor and he had some variety. But once he did the film Born to Kill in 1947, he was typecast more from Born to Kill, in which he plays this, homicidal lunatic, more so than he was in Dillinger. In that role, he was so scary and so cold and such a cold-blooded killer that they were forced to add into the movie a note saying that he was mentally unbalanced. They put like a line in the film for that. The censors made
Mhm.
them do that because this was seen as an even worse example than Public Enemy #1, and that stayed with him through his career.
I liked him in I believe it was called Female Jungle, the one where he was the cop that drank, and I mean, it
Yeah.
kind of like reflected real life, and he blacked out and he wasn't even sure
Uh-huh.
if he had murdered the woman or not.
Yeah.
I thought he was really good in that, and maybe it probably helped reading this book first and knowing that that kind of reflected real life. What was it, the 70s or 80s when that there was the 24-year-old
Oh,
that
yeah.
he hung out with? She, for as
Went
far
on.
as we know, killed herself, but nobody really knows the story. It'd be hard to talk about this book without talking about that story. That's a story that I'm so lucky nothing like that ever happened to me when I was drinking. Where because I woken up and not remembered things, but to wake up and somebody that you know and loved is dead and you're not sure exactly what happened. Like,
And a terrible time for him in the 70s. He was still crawling toward a comeback. He was in a movie Such Good Friends with Diane Cannon that was directed by Otto Preminger. He was getting work in television commercials, but and then in 19 I think it was 1973, he's stabbed in the stomach in a bar fight that spills out in the street in Hell's Kitchen. He gets stabbed and he's almost killed. I mean, he gets gut stabbed, and he's in the hospital for a while. While he's doing that, he's on television in various television commercials. So, but then comes the story that everyone saw as the greatest shame of his career. It was a photograph that was taken of Tierney in the theater district, and the headline for most of the papers said, "From handsome to handsome." Lawrence Tierney was found working as a horse and buggy driver in Central Park, and if you saw the coverage, it was as if that was worse than being found dead in a bathroom with a needle in your arm. This was worse than murdering someone. This was
but
like,
he was very happy doing that, wasn't
well,
he?
that's the thing. He was very happy. It was the one picture of Tierney where he was smiling, and he was happy doing it. And he talked about it later in a television interview that he did. That he loved it. I mean, he loved having the kids on his lap and letting them pretend to ride. It was there was no pressure on him. He was out in the open. He was riding with a horse. He loved it. But then again, the following year, he's in an apartment visiting a friend of his, a young woman, and there's various tales and stories of who exactly she was. Was she a secretary? Was she a hooker? Was she a junkie? Whatever. It's early in the evening. It's not the middle of the night. It's sometime around 8 o'clock at night. She's in a nightgown. He's on the couch. They're drinking. They're drinking from a bottle. They're drinking from glasses. And according to her, according to Tierney, she said, "I'm going to go out the window." Fourth story, she went out the window, and the police, peeled her up out of the alley in the back alley, and she died. And they grilled Tierney. They grilled him for a couple of days under the lights at the precinct, and he stuck to his story. I love the kid. I don't know what happened. We were drinking. She said, "I'm going to go out the window," and she went, and she fell, and the police bought his story. Uh, I talked to various people who knew Tierney. He talked about it a little bit. He never really told what happened because I don't think he really remembered what happened. Everyone who knew him said, "Let's just make one thing clear. There's no way he threw this woman out the window. There's no way that he did it." There's stories that she was a junkie and that her dealer or her pimp showed up and that
Mhm.
Tierney and him had a fight and she went out the window and was shoved out, or Tierney was forced to witness her being thrown out the window, because he did tell some people I got the justice in the end. I got the justice. But then again, he told lots of stories. He told one of his friends that he drove a tank in World War II. He made up stories. He told stories. He lived the legend. But that was one that was one of the last times that he made headlines.
Yeah.
Was that? It was very sad.
It's a very sad story for him. It's a very sad story for the young lady, because at the end of the day, what does it matter what her role was, or what her, whether she was a prostitute or a junkie? Like, what does it matter? I mean, these are two adults hanging out, and something strange happened. And
Yeah.
man, I can't even imagine. And talking about this book, like, so you're waiting for a happy ending or something, and it never really comes. But it wasn't all tears, and it wasn't all hard. But at the end, especially the epilogue, is his nephews and everybody sharing his ashes, and the people that are left that had a little bit of love for him. It kind of made you. It was a nice little. It was a nice little touch at the end of the book. Like, like I really enjoyed that. And what I really enjoyed was the one nephew, I think it was a nephew, saying that he was told somebody, this is Lawrence Tierney in here, and he had his ashes, and they're like, Lawrence Tierney. He goes, oh, Elaine's father, Mr. So-and-so from Reservoir Dogs. Like as much as people don't want to be typecast or remembered, I thought that was, I thought, wow, that's, at the end of the day, that is what people nowadays are going to remember him for, because not everybody's a Hollywood nerd like me or something. So I thought that was kind of touching.
Well, it was. And those nephews of his, or their cousins, they were second cousins. They live in Brooklyn. I went out and visited them earlier this year at the Knights of Columbus Hall in Brooklyn, and spent an afternoon, drinking with them.
That's okay. You don't have to be sorry.
And they're terrific. They're my Brooklyn family now, and I'm their LA cousin. Two great guys, Eddie and Danny Leahy, and their father was a decorated New York City cop who got along very well with Larry, the so-called cop hater, and got along very well with him and got a big kick out of him. And
that was the guy that let him live with him a few times, right?
Yeah, he was living with one of the nephews.
Do they remind you of Tierney at all? Any of them?
They do. They're Irish guys who like to drink, and they're great storytellers, and they're great big guys with big personalities. You could see the talent that runs through the family. When I dealt a lot with Timothy Tierney, his nephew, who is the son of the actor Scott Brady, whose actual name was Gerard Tierney. He had his own great career. He died young. I got a lot of stories, from Timothy, and Tim. I had to remind him a couple of times. I said, you realize your family is one of greatness. Your father, your uncle, your other uncle did great things. They made a real mark, and you guys are making a mark. I hope that you're really proud of them. I know there's a lot of pain. Lawrence Tierney caused a lot of pain and a lot of suffering with his family. His mother died of a heart attack in 1960. She drank. The whole family drank. Because the police found a bottle near the bed and some sleeping pills. The initial report that went out was this might be a suicide. And so that made the papers. Right. And eventually the family talked about it. They looked at it. They knew what her habits were. And no, it wasn't a suicide. She had actually gotten out of the hospital only a couple of weeks earlier because she had had a heart attack before that. But she continued to drink. It wasn't anything deliberate. But Larry blamed himself. Other members of the family, the pain that you caused this woman, forced her to do this. And there's a legendary incident, which again, nobody in the family can track down, but everybody says there was a fist fight in the middle of the street between Scott Brady and Lawrence Tierney. And they didn't talk again for another 20 years, more than that, until the death of Edward Tierney, their youngest brother, when Larry showed up for the funeral of Ed. And that was the first time the brothers had talked.
That was when he hung out in the truck or something, didn't he? He hung out in the bed of the truck.
he made a scene. He made a scene, and as he did when Scott Brady died a couple of years later at age 60. The cousins from the cousins from Brooklyn accompanied him to the funeral, because at the time he had a role in Prizzi's Honor, directed by John Huston. And you look at who he worked with, and because his friend Jack Nicholson, who he knew back in the 50s before Nicholson was anyone, got him a role in Prizzi's Honor. He had to go from Brooklyn back to Hollywood to his brother's funeral. What the family remembers most about that was that he and Royal Dano brought a bottle of whiskey to the wake, and everybody got a good look at Tierney urinating in the gutter outside the funeral home. That sort of embarrassment for the family again. But again, they realize that his life is very entertaining for a lot of us and people who read a book like that, but not so much for those who were closest to him.
Right, and I think that's why I like to stress that it's not all that humorous. Like I used to watch the show Shameless with my wife, and it's a funny show, right? But like by the fourth season, I was like, this isn't funny to me anymore. Like those are my people. Like, no, I could be sober forever, but those are my people. I mean, I have a lot of similarities with Tierney's family. My family, my great grandfather came here from Ireland, and my dad was the oldest of 10, 13 or 14 if you count aunts and uncles that I'd have never met that were kind of like fathered outside the family. And you share a lot of trauma and you share a lot of guilt and shame, but at the end of the day, what you said was beautiful. There was talent in that family, and there was love, and it's like that everywhere. It's if you can see the good side in things, there's something better. There's something better there in a story. So I mean, I think it's a great book. I got this book for Father's Day. I believe my wife got it for me, and for my birthday, my dad and mom got me Dwayne Epstein's Making of the Dirty Dozen. And I was just said to myself, this is going to be the season of the Tough Guy Book Club, because I admire you guys and Paul Talbot and people like that. I admire you so much because you guys, you're able to do something that I'm not able to do, but we share like a similar interest, although I just don't have I think I might have like a little bit of a learning disability. Like I love, like I'll see somebody on TV or I'll hear a name and I will research the hell out of them, but I could never do what you guys do. Like it's amazing to me, the amount of research and stuff that you guys do. So, I mean, I just like, and I even asked for two more of your books for Christmas. Because at the end of the day, like it's what's cool about this format, the podcast format, and what's cool about what you got, like all right. I heard you say in an interview, I'm not a film expert, right? And I really related to that because I do this podcast and I'll get like people asking me questions through Facebook and stuff, and I'll be like, and I think they think I'm a Charles Bronson expert, which I may have said before, but kind of jokingly. And it's like, but at the end of the day, whether you're talking about Quentin Tarantino or or a journalist like you or a podcaster like me, we're all fans of just like of names and of people and of pop culture and stories. You know what I mean? And it's a beautiful thing to be able to just sit and discuss those things that we love and to read about them. Like I said, I think I have like a bit of a learning disability where I have a little bit of a comprehension problems. Like I might read 5 pages of a book and have to go back and read them again.
Sure.
But when I have a book like yours or a book like Dwayne's or a book like Paul Talbot's, like I can focus in a way that I can't focus on like what my wife's sending me to the store for. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it's such a gift to me, and I really appreciate everything that you guys do. And unless you have anything else to say, I think that was a great interview. I think that was a great episode.
No, thank you. It is funny. One of the criticisms that I get from the book is basically he's good on the life, but not so great on the films. So, people wanted more about what was going on, behind the scenes of, the production of films and details like that, which there's not a lot of that. There's some.
Yeah. How
But
would you
again,
find all that though? I mean, that's a different, you'd be studying it from a different angle that you're not, this is a story about this man's life. I mean, I would
yeah.
think, yeah, to study the films and everything, then you'd be more studying like RKO pictures or what was the B movie, the company he was in?
It was
The King brothers, right?
the King brothers. Yeah, I think they were with Monogram.
Yeah. How hard is it to find that kind of information?
It's just a matter of, I've always done a lot of research and go down those rabbit holes, and it's out there. You've got to go to libraries. You find books. I bring books in. You find the story of him on VE Day, having sex with Shelley Winters. I found that by digging into.
I love that story. I forgot
Shelley
to bring
Winters.
that up.
He didn't like that, by the way. His friends told me that he thought that she was very, he thought that was private. She shouldn't have talked about that.
I thought it was cute. I like that. I thought it was cute that he asked her. He basically asked her to go to a motel with him. Basically asking her to have sex with him, and she goes, "Will it take very long?"
He said no.
He said no.
But, great. Same with Gloria Vanderbilt. Her book as well talks, briefly about how he was sort of a rebound after Frank Sinatra dumped her. So, she's great little stories like that. You find them everywhere. It's a matter of just digging and compiling.
Speaking of Gloria Vanderbilt, what happened to society women? Like, is that a thing anymore? Like, is that what Paris Hilton and the Kardashians are? Like, what happened to those? What happened to those days? Like, what? Not that I would have been a part of society or upper society.
Well, I mean, times have changed about who we look at as being, high society now. They look at people like the Kardashians or Meghan Markle or people like that. It's all a matter of, I think, social media has, destroyed a lot of those great ththings that we had back in the day. But I have another book that I've completed that's going to be out in April on Marlon Brando.
Mm-hmm.
Marlon Brando is. His 100th birthday is coming up in April, also the 20th anniversary of his death. And again, this is a Hollywood book, but it's not like the usual Hollywood. It's not strictly a biography of Brando. It's a story on the cultural influence that he has today.
Yeah.
And that left. And it's everybody from Elvis Presley to the Beatles to punk to Andy Warhol to Lady Gaga, all different chapters talking about Brando's great influence. And actually, the greatest influence that he had is on Hollywood activism. He was the original Hollywood activist against the death. He helped create the state of Israel through his work, which is all explained in the book. So again, it's a book that doesn't have a lot about the films. The films are all mentioned, bouncing off, but it's not deep dives into the production.
So you just sold me on the book, though. You just sold me on it, because at first I was like, man, Marlon Brando. I've heard about Marlon Brando. Like I'm not that interested in a big name like that. But now you just sold me on it because you're telling me about this different angle, and that's interesting. That's where I think someone like you, it's more, you get a better story from you than you do when the person writes their own autobiography. Because when a person writes their own autobiography, I mean, my memory, like I have memories that have been proven wrong, and I can see them in my head. You know what I mean? Like, oh, remember when we all went to this waterfall or something, me, mom, and dad, and my dad's like, that didn't happen, and I can see them. So like, I don't trust an autobiography, not to mention it's going to be just straight their life, or if it's or the making of the movies or whatever. And to me, that sounds a lot more interesting. His effect on, and I love that you said punk, because I like being a fan of I'm born in 1975, but I the things that I love make me seem a lot older, and discovering like the Ramones and the Cramps and bands like that, New York Dolls. There's a lot of old time references in that music. You know what I mean? I mean, the New York Dolls are kind of the Dead End Kids, kind of, or the Bowery Boys, but with makeup, but with makeup on. You know what I mean? And the Ramones always like sung about like old things, and it would make me be interested in looking into this old science fiction movies or Baseball Manager or some weird reference that they put in one of those songs, you know?
Right, right.
And I think early 70s, mid 70s New York punk, The Dictators is another band. There was a lot of like,
We just lost one of the dictators.
yes,
This
Scott
Scott.
Kempner, yeah.
It's funny. Andy Chernoff is in the Brando book. I interviewed him for the Brando book
Oh, neat.
about the dictators. Yeah,
Andy's such a good dude.
yeah.
But what was the point I was making? It's very early 70s punk was very almost vaudeville-ish, you know what I mean? Even
Yeah.
the Beastie Boys, like that characters, that's not punk, but that they kind of brought this like almost like vaudeville comedy act
Yeah.
to hip hop. Like, I don't know. I don't know, going off on a tangent now, but I feel
Yeah,
like
no, the punk days were very, the bands were so varied where you had a scene where you had, Patti Smith,
mhm,
television, and the Shirts, and you had the Ramones, and you had
yeah.
the Talking Heads. All these, they were all, for very different kinds of music. Blondie, that all came together in one scene. It was
And I
those.
feel like I'm sorry.
No, I was saying they were great days. It was it was also a scene for, I don't want to say losers, but
Mhm.
it was our own scene. It was our.
Yeah.
I was lucky. I grew up in Connecticut, and I grew up outside Bridgeport. And I was in high school in 1973. There's a little ad in the paper. The New York Dolls are playing at the Stratfield Motor Inn, and
Oh, wow.
got to see the New York Dolls right around the time their first album came out. And then I was involved in the beginnings of the punk scene in Connecticut, which was one of the first scenes to start, because the groups that played CBGBs in Manhattan, well, if they wanted to play outside of New York, well, they can get in the van or get in the car
Yeah.
and drive up to Connecticut, play, and then get back home and sleep in their own bed. And so
Mhm.
I got to see a lot of these groups in New Haven and in Bridgeport, and
Yeah.
a punk scene started in Connecticut. But by that time, I had I had an early punk band, and we broke up, and I started writing about the scene, and I was writing about it for the local papers. And I met a guy named Tom Hearn, who was one of the initiators of the group, and he's from Cheshire, Connecticut, and he grew up with three guys: John Holmstrom, Jed
Oh.
Dunn, and Legs McNeil.
Oh,
And
yeah.
three guys from Cheshire started Punk Magazine, and
Mhm.
they were there from the beginning. And I became good friends with Legs, known Legs for like more than 40 years, and got to know John, and got to know these guys. And so I was involved with it, from those early days. And the best part about it was I wanted to make a documentary film about 10 years ago. It never came off. And it was the story of how Tom, at the time, back in the 70s, was, again, he was sort of a scene stir. He wasn't a musician. He went home and learned how to play guitar, and now he's got a band that plays, every weekend at clubs in Connecticut. And all the people that were part of that punk scene in the 70s, they're still doing it in Connecticut now.
That's
Their
awesome.
fathers, their grandfathers, they're old, but they've lived the punk ethos for
Mhm.
the last 40 years. Where there's a morality, a punk morality, and a punk way of life, where it doesn't matter if you're famous or not.
Right.
It doesn't matter if your scene led to some big hits. We're still doing it. We're entertaining ourselves, and we're inviting younger people in, and it's great that it's still alive today.
Yeah, I think it's harder to be punk these days because I think there was such a do-it-yourself and
Yeah.
underground is kind of a cliche term to use, but it was a kind of like a do-it-yourself thing where now it's, yeah, you can still be do it yourself, but it's so easy to do it yourself. It's so easy to get stuff out there
Yeah.
where there was something so exciting about finding a tape. Sometimes it wasn't even like really put out sometimes it wasn't even really put out by a label. It was like one that somebody made. Like I remember a band from Delaware when I in the 80s when I was there called Infant Mortality, and it sounded like they played, they taped their practice onto a boombox and were
Yeah.
giving it out. And there was just something about it that I just don't I don't see it ever being the same, but there is. But when you hear about people that are still doing it and handing it down, like that's why I always enjoy seeing like people in their 50s, 60s, 70s even still doing it. I mean, we got a guy here in Philadelphia. I not sure how old he is, but his name's Mick Cancer. He was in a band called the Sick Kids, Pink Slip Daddy, and he's still doing it with the Mick Cancer and the Has-Beens, or the Leftovers.
Right, right.
And I think the last thing I saw on the internet, he was doing it on somebody's front porch. There's a front porch fest where bands are playing on front porches. Yeah. But I mean, it's like the guy's got to be. He was old when I was a kid. You know, he's probably was younger than I am now. But I remember like seeing him come out stage and be like, "Oh, this guy's awesome," because he looks like he's been through it, like really through it. You know.
Yes, yeah.
But
the Please Kill Me site was very good for keeping that alive.
What happened to that? I looked for it today, and they gave me a number to suicide hotline.
I think it's still, the archives are still there. Please Kill Me is defunct. There was a split between the founders. And 2 years ago, 2 Christmases ago, I worked with Legs and we started up a site called Legsville.com.
I'll have to check that out. I forget about websites. In this day of social media, I forget about websites. Yeah.
So we've got Legsville. We have put a lot of stories up on there and video interviews that Legs does.
I would love that. I'm gonna have to check that out. We could probably talk for hours because we do are like we're into a lot of the same things.
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
And Charles Bronson. I told you I was on a Charles Bronson binge.
Yeah.
About a month or so ago. It's a lot of stuff that I hadn't seen in a while or hadn't seen.
Well, dig this. So the reason this show's called This Week in Charles Bronson is what we usually do is we get a guest and we assign them a movie. And then what we do is we talk about the movie, but then we talk about the director, the other characters in the movie, the music. And then when we do is we take the date of release and we see what was on TV, we see what was in the theater at that time, see what the top 10 records were. Or if we have somebody on that's like Jeffrey Love Spector, who's in the music industry, we had him make his top 10 list of albums from that year. And that's what so it's a fun pop culture it's a fun way to use Charles Bronson to as a springboard into other things. So you can't just talk about Charles Bronson. I mean, that would just get old, but it's a good specific thing. Like I'll tell you something, for attracting a big audience, there's nothing like a real specific, like some people are very like focused like on one thing. So, but yeah,
I have two Charles.
I'll sign you a movie. You can come back.
Oh, that'll be fun. I do have 2 Charles Bronson trivia bits.
Okay.
My former production partner was Brett Hudson. Brett was from a group called the Hudson Brothers back in the 70s.
Yeah, yes.
Brett was, his brother. They've gotten back together. I think they're doing a 50th anniversary tour in 2024. It's Brett, Mark, and
Mark was on Gilbert's podcast. Frank Santapadre's podcast, really, but
yeah, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, so Brett and I had a production company for about 10 years, and in the 70s, Brett was living in Brentwood, and Charles Bronson was one of his neighbors, and he used to walk his dog with Charles Bronson.
Wow.
And he knew him as being a very gentle man. Another story was 1982, Madison Square Garden, the Arms benefit. It was a benefit show for multiple sclerosis. Ronnie Lane from the Faces had been stricken with it, and they had a number of concerts in England and a few in America. And Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts for the rhythm section. Joe Cocker performed, a lot of different artists. But the big thing was that from the Yardbirds, Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and Jeff Beck all performed separately and together. Jimmy Page came out and played solo on his double neck guitar. And what was the first song that he performed?
Was it from the Death Wish 2 soundtrack?
It was from the Death Wish 2 soundtrack.
That's awesome.
And everybody's like, what song is this? And it was like, look it up now. And he performed from Death Wish 2. And I was like,
That's the theme music to this show until somebody comes after us.
yeah, there you go. So
I'm surprised they haven't. They took one of our episodes down because of a Van Dyke Parks song. But for some reason, maybe we don't use the Jimmy Page guitar for that long in the intro, right. But I don't know.
It depends who goes after it. Interesting. But there you go. Great podcast. And I follow you, of course, on all the social media sites, and it's very cool.
I appreciate that so much because you're like, I look up to guys like you and Dwayne Epstein and Paul Talbot. And I just think what you guys do is so neat. And yeah, maybe I hope you'll come back on. We'll sign you a movie and we'll talk. And like I said, like the cool thing about it is we talk about, like the other people in the movie, the director. So we wind up going up in one episode, the Chados Land episodes opens up with a 5-minute Three Stooges story that had nothing to do with the movie at all. So it's all over the place.
That's great too, because that's my next book.
Three Stooges?
It's coming out after the brand. Well, here's the thing. My agent said to me after the Lawrence Tierney book was, you got to write a book about somebody that people have heard of.
Yeah, I was going to say you went from like you really went like from unheard of to like the most popular actor of all times.
And so who is the person that could complete that trilogy but Shemp Howard? I've written a biography of Shemp Howard.
I thought you were going to say Joe Besser.
Yeah, no, sorry. But it's another great story.
Well, Shemp is such a cult hero because he's one of those. He's kind of punk rock in the way that he's like the unsung stooge, but he's got this hardcore following that's like maniacal for Shemp.
And a story that people probably don't know because of what I like to call the Stooges industrial complex. There's a story that's out there, an official story. But I've kind of dug through that to find out the real story of who Shemp was before he rejoined the Three Stooges. So anyway, that's later in 2024.
Oh, I can't wait. I'm excited. I say, look, I want you to come back. Even if this show's taking its own turn. If you want to just come back and talk about the Marlon Brando book, you can. Or I'll make some kind of link to Charles Bronson. We'll wear fake mustaches or something.
Yeah, we'll find one. We'll find a link to Bronson. I'll find it.
All right. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to This Week in Charles Bronson with our guest, Burt Kearns. And I just want to say congratulations to my producer, the teenage heartthrob, Danny Getz. He's 36, but I call him teenage because I'm like 90. He just got engaged to his lovely longtime girlfriend, Megan Getz. Yes, they have the same last name in real life before marriage, spelled differently. I have to explain that to people.
Hello, I am here.
Oh, you're here. And I've
been listening for like 45 minutes.
I don't know if they know how much I love them because like most our relationship is mostly professional, but like I just love those two so much. And I'm so excited and so happy for them. And let's hear it for Dan and Megan Getz getting hitched.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome very much. And this has been This Week in Charles Bronson with our guest, Hollywood Burt Kearns.